I'm joined right now by my great friend and learned colleague, Caleb Maupin, who is world-renowned and an esteemed RT journalist and investigative reporter and the like. Caleb, welcome again, my friend.
I'm glad to be here, as always.
Let's start with wherever you would like. What's the first thing you want to say about yesterday's attack, bombing, retaliation, military action in Syria by President Trump?
Well, this point cannot be made enough, and you'll notice that my colleagues in the mainstream media are just glossing over it. This airfield that was hit, that was attacked with Tomahawk cruise missiles from our government, was an airfield that exclusively served the purpose of fighting against ISIS and al-Nusra terrorists. And in the aftermath of the attack on this airfield, the ISIS and the al-Nusra terrorists were emboldened, and they escalated their attacks. We essentially began operating as al-Qaeda and ISIS's air force today, and we attacked one of the primary air bases that was being used to fight against ISIS. If you're afraid of terrorism, if you're upset about 9/11, you can't be supporting what's going on right now. This is a pro-terrorist action. The Syrian government is fighting against ISIS. They've been fighting against them since they were formed. They're the primary enemy of ISIS on the battlefield. And we're not fighting them. We're fighting against the Syrian government. This is crazy. This is very, very, very crazy. And there's a lot of confusion about what's going on here.
Okay.
But we need to, yeah.
No, let's stop because I'm with you 100%.
Sure.
First, some might say you should never be ever accused of, quote, emboldening ISIS or emboldening terrorism. They are sick. They are demented. What they're doing is obviously wrong. So I understand what you're saying. Strategically, though, let's make it very, very simple. When Syria, who played a tremendous role in attacking ISIS with the cooperation of Russia, around the Jarablus corridor for years, for a period of time that the mainstream media ignored altogether. When you remove and basically make dysfunctional, non-functioning the airstrip from which Syrian Air Force took off to fight ISIS, you therefore make it virtually impossible or much more difficult to fight ISIS. So what we did was we disenabled Syria to fight ISIS by attacking this.
Yes.
Now, is it true, is it not true that the Tomahawk missiles missed the runways themselves?
Well, we're hearing different reports about it. There is one report saying that 23 of the 59 missiles that were shot actually hit the airbase. That's not confirmed as of yet. We've also heard that Russia somehow stopped. I've seen on Twitter and places that Russia somehow stopped the missiles from hitting, that they deflected them somehow. We don't know if that's true or not. I'm not going to say that's true until I get an official confirmation of that. So there's a lot of rumors flying around here. But what we do know, what we've heard from Donald Trump from his mouth, is that we did strike against the Syrian government, that we took the first direct strike against the Syrian government. And there's no question that if there's two sides in a war and you attack one side, the other side benefits. And in this case, the other side is known as ISIS, and it's something that people are terrified all over the world of.
Now, as you know, those in the mainstream media have never been conversant, Caleb, with those individuals, because as you know, prototypically American, the quintessential reportage has always been good guy, bad guy. And once you, and I don't mean to trivialize this in the least, but I'm just going to be candid as I normally am. When you hold up pictures of children who are gassed, dead, whatever, being held by grieving parents, and you point to that guy. Let me give you an analogy. In court, there is a rule called 403. 403 evidence prevents, in essence, actual relevant evidence from being used if it tends to inflame the jury. For example, you cannot ask a parent to identify their child by using the most gory photo so that the jury sees this woman scream. So when you see good-hearted American and international folks look at parents, identify with this, and then you turn around and say, who was the bastard who did this? And we say, that guy, Assad. They put two and two together, and that's it. It's not in their DNA. It's not in anybody's DNA to sit there and say, now, wait a minute. Maybe this really wasn't him. Maybe it was a false flag. Maybe it was actually al-Nusra. Maybe it was al-Qaeda contingents. Maybe people don't think like that. So let's address this. What evidence is there that Assad did not do this?
Well,
or that Syria is not responsible?
Let's back up from that for a moment, because what you're pointing out is something that needs to be said, okay? Human beings, we are naturally compassionate creatures. When we see, another human being, especially one that we deem to be innocent, being harmed, we want to help them. This is just basic human instincts. We don't want to see people being harmed. So if you flash pictures on the TV screen 24 hours a day of people in chemical attack, and then you give the impression that the only thing that the U.S. government is doing is trying to rescue these poor people, and you don't tell people the details. And let's keep in mind, they've done, National Geographic has published statistics that, a high percentage of Americans cannot find their own country on a map. So we're not exactly a population that's deeply tuned into world events and following things. So if you just show pictures like this on TV and appeal to that compassionate instinct and say, we just want to rescue them, that's why we want to do this, you're going to get a large percentage of people that will go along with it. What surprises me is how, this recent attack didn't have that level of public support. There is public opposition and public skepticism about this.
Where?
And it's very high comparatively. You should look at some of these polls that are coming out. It's very interesting. Even though the media seems to be seeing a unison song in support of this, the skepticism among the American public and the feeling like maybe we should focus on our problems here at home, maybe we should be rebuilding our roads and bridges and not trying to fight Syria's fight for them, those sentiments are very, very widespread. In fact, I would say Donald Trump was elected because he appealed to those very sentiments, and now he's taken the other move. But let's be real. Even this endless, it's essentially a commercial for war on American television right now. It is a 24/7 war infomercial. Attack Syria. We got to rescue the poor innocent children from dictator Assad. This is a 24/7 infomercial on mainstream media,
okay.
And it's not working. It's not working. People aren't buying it.
Stop for 1 second. There are those people who are very, very reluctant, and as you know, and let's a little bit about you. You're from the heartland. You know how, and I don't mean to. We say this sometimes. We tend to minimize and kind of make the typical American sound like the Jethro, the hayseed, the sitting on a bale of hay. But there's a lot of folks out there who, frankly, they say, this is my country, this is my military, and they are very proud of it. And they are not groomed, first of all, to understand what we call conspiracy theories. But let's go back to the first thing you said. Donald Trump in 2013 said, in fact, it's funny how you can cache tweets and archive tweets. He said Obama cannot attack Syria. He needs a Security Council approval. You had Tillerson the other day saying, I'm not interested in the regime change. You had Donald Trump the other day saying, I think we're making some headway here. Two questions. Number one, what changed? And number two, let's assume that Assad is not insane. Why in the name of God would he decide to gas his people now when he's winning? Does this make any sense to you? Attack either of those questions.
Absolutely no sense. And let's be real, okay? The United Nations, every report has come out on chemical weapons and said, while there's question, they're not sure that the Syrian government is using chemical weapons, they are completely adamant that the anti-government fighters who have been supported by our tax dollars are getting U.S.-made guns handed to them, are getting trained in training camps just across the border in Jordan by CIA officers that are training these guys. They've been using sarin nerve gas. They've been using chlorine. They've been using all these chemical weapons the entire war. For the last 7 years, the anti-government fighters have undisputedly, Carla Del Ponte, the United Nations, all the bodies point out, they're using chemical weapons. No one seems to care about that. However, there's allegations, not proof, not solid proof, but allegations that maybe the Syrian government is using chemical weapons, and that is used to justify The hypocrisy in this is very, very extreme.
But why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't it? Going back again to my being a trial lawyer, there's this prior fact evidence, the MO.
Sure.
If you are a person who is known to commit a robbery in a particular way, wearing a particular mask, saying a particular thing, and you've done it in the past, I can introduce that and say, this is what he does. Now, what people don't understand about this is they have to ask, why would the Syria... Now, this is going to sound silly now. Why would the rebels, who are, we thought, after all, aren't these proud Syrians, Free Syrian Army?
They're Caleb, not Syrians.
Are you... Wait a minute.
A lot of them are not from... Most of them, I would say, are not from Syria. A lot of them are from Qatar, from Jordan, from Bahrain, but they've had fighters from as far away as Malaysia, Indonesia, Islamic extremists, Al-Qaeda, the kind of people that carried out the 9/11 attacks, like the Osama bin Laden types of the entire world, are all finding their way to Syria. It is a global jihad to bring down the Syrian government.
Why?
All of the most extreme, fanatical, Wahhabi extremist elements, right, are all going to Syria.
Why?
They're going to Syria. They have been, the Syrian government is a secular government. Let's keep this in mind. It's not like Saudi Arabia. The government's not based on Islam. It's a secular government, and it's the Ba'ath Socialist Party that runs the country. Most of the people in Syria are Sunni Muslims. However, they have Alawites. That's a different branch of Islam. They've got Christians there, a very large Christian community. One of the largest Christian communities in the Middle East is in Syria. They've got all kinds of different religious groups there. The Druze, they've got all kinds of different religious groups. It's a government that has, women in office, holding office. This is a secular nationalist government that is modernizing. It's been working with China. It's been working with Russia. It's been working with Iran to try and build up their infrastructure. They have labor unions in their factories. Comparatively, I'm not going to say they're perfect. There's all kinds of corruption there. There's all kinds of things that I'm sure people have grievances about. But if you compare them to Saudi Arabia, which is an absolute monarchy that cuts people's heads off, where women are not allowed to drive, it's actually one of the more progressive and modern regimes in the region.
Why is the CIA involved or in cahoots? And before I get to that, King Abdullah was here from Jordan.
Sure.
And he's
King Abdullah. It's President Assad. We've got King... We've got King Salman in Saudi Arabia. We've got King Abdullah in Jordan, King of Qatar, the King of Bahrain, King of Kuwait, kings fighting against he's President Assad. They had an election there in which multiple parties ran. It was internationally monitored. In 2012, just after the Arab Spring protests in Syria, they wrote a whole new constitution full of democratic reforms. They've done a lot. Syria comparatively, again, you have to compare all of this, right? I'm not saying that Syria has the level of freedom that we have here in the United States. I would never make that kind of claim. But compared to all the countries in the region that are aligned with the United States and are participating in the effort to bring down the government, Syria is a progressive and modern country. And that's why they're under attack. These jihadists, these extremists, they don't like that. They want to replace it with something that looks like Saudi Arabia. They want to replace it with the Islamic State that ISIS is setting up.
But when President Trump was meeting with King Abdullah, do you think he was saying, hey, listen, I know a lot of you guys, these folks, you're training them? Because you have to ask. You said they're being trained by the CIA in Jordan.
Yes.
What is the CIA having to do or involving itself with these crazy fanatical people? What I understand people going into this weird kind of a jihadist vacuum into Syria to topple them. Okay, fine, make it a caliphate or whatever the hell they're trying to do. But explain the CIA connection.
Well, it's certainly not being done for you and me. It's not something that's being done for the benefit of average Americans. I think average Americans like you and I, like the people I grew up around in Ohio, people here in New York City, are far more afraid of al-Qaeda than they are of the Syrian Ba'ath Socialist government. But let's talk about what's going on here. Syria, as an independent country that fought against the French, they were colonized by the French, they established their independence, and they have established a planned economy. The banks, the factories, and the industries in Syria are centrally planned, And they've been developing, and they're aligned with Iran. They've had friendly relations. I mean, it was on and off. They had a falling out with Iraq, but they were friendly to Iraq. And they've been cooperating to build themselves up independently. They're not a colony of Wall Street. Wall Street bankers don't run Syria. It's an independent country that has established economic independence, and it's come to the aid of other countries that are trying to do that. I think one thing that is a factor here is I have to say this is that Syria has been one of the main sponsors of Palestinian resistance against Israel, and that is historically a fact. There are the Syrian government houses and provides infrastructure to the Palestinian Authority. Now you would think the Israelis would be far more threatened by Al Qaeda and ISIS than they were by the Syrian government, but they are on record as being a sponsor of Palestinian resistance.
Is it not another issue there? Well, let's talk about two things. Let's talk about this pipeline theory. We talk about the pipeline. There were two pipelines. Sure. One that was allegedly going to go, ideally, from Iran through Iraq to Syria, and then to the Mediterranean, then perhaps to Europe. But that suited everyone fine. But what they wanted, they being the globalists, whoever they are,
sure,
they wanted to subvert this and basically to provide a more direct pipeline through Qatar and Turkey to Europe, bypassing Russia, thwarting Russia. But it's again about oil. Either way, without getting too bogged down. But it's about pipeline. That's why. That's the main reason. And also its geopolitical strategic location for providing stability or instability of the Middle East. Attack either of those positions.
Sure. I mean, the Syrian government, at the time that this war began, around 2011, they were talking about building a pipeline connecting the Islamic Republic of Iran and Iraq to the Mediterranean. And that would then put oil onto the international markets, and it would enable Iran to start selling oil and competing with U.S. and British oil companies. And that's a factor. And the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and Qataris had been talking about an alternative. They wanted their pipeline to go through Syria and up into Europe. And of course, the Saudis have been essentially, what you might call a vassal of U.S. oil companies since 1945. I mean, they've been a cooperation. So the Syrian government made a choice to economically cooperate with Iranian oil, Iran's state-owned oil company, and Iraqi oil fields, and not to cooperate with the oil companies of the United States, Saudi Arabia, and their vassals in the region. And that's certainly a factor as well. Let's not delude ourselves.
So let's stop right there. So geopolitically and in this petrocracy, whatever, with Tillerson at the helm of the Secretary of State. And by the way, and let me just say, and you being a historian yourself, ideally, when you look at what the Secretary of State, what the State Department originally was involved in doing initially, it was basically years ago to provide license tags for ambassadors and visas. And all of a sudden, maybe post John Foster Dulles, I don't know what that turning point was, you've got basically Tillerson and Secretaries of State acting almost like defense secretaries, talking about the architects of war, in addition to Nikki Haley, basically rattling sabers. This is something which, if you think about it historically, we have not done. All right, so there's that oil part. But what people don't want to understand, or don't like to think about, is that their Donald Trump, the idea of him being said, come here, we're from the deep state, a term that nobody used before until now. Now we're talking deep state. We want you to get rid of Bannon and Flynn and Lewandowski or whoever it is. These people, remember, Bannon was against this globalist. He did not fit in. We're going to teach you a lesson. Play ball with us. You were elected. We don't like what you said about not going to war with Syria or you're requiring the UN. Who do you think you are? He might have been spooked. Some people are suggesting he was scared. And all of a sudden, Caleb, guess what? The Russian investigation is gone. Nobody's talking about that anymore because here he is. He's basically sticking his thumb in the eyes of Putin and Russia. So how can he be in cahoots with them? And you have the left, the right. You had Lawrence O'Donnell basically singing paeans and hymns of praise, and you have Fareed Zakaria overnight. So he has elevated himself to this status of hero, and you can't overlook that.
Sure. Well, let's do some American history. Let's look back at the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, we'll remember President Kennedy was president of the United States at the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Cuban, the exile community went down and tried to overthrow the Castro government. They failed. And then the Pentagon wanted President Kennedy to send in the army to back them up and go in and topple the Cuban government. Well, he refused to do that. And then there was a huge backlash in the United States. The John Birch Society, the Republicans, they were all out there calling him what? A Russian agent. Oh, how dare he? He's working for the Russians. How dare he not invade Cuba? He's not loyal to us. He's loyal to the Kremlin. Look, he's hanging out with the civil rights movement. There's a lot of commies in there in the civil rights movement. Oh, he's un-American. He's a traitor and all of that. He goes to Texas and gets assassinated. Lyndon Johnson comes in, and it was that atmosphere, that go get 'em, the president's a traitor atmosphere that basically pushed the Democratic Party into being the party that launched the Vietnam War. They were constantly getting accused of being foreign agents and loyal to the Russians and soft on the commies and all of that. And so they escalated things in Vietnam trying to prove themselves, right? And that's a historical situation here. And I would say a similar thing happened to Trump. I would say this is...
Also, make sure that we understand that in those particular days, of which I am vaguely a tad more conversant, having been there and remembering that, and being from Florida, where believe me, a lot of the Alpha 66 guys and those folks, I knew them very, very well. But Vietnam was just about ideology in a post-OSS, post-Cold War, post-whatever. There wasn't oil in Vietnam. They weren't there for the rice, futures, the rice trade. And that was almost pure ideology. This is geopolitical money, Wall Street, deep state meeting, all of that stuff combined. But you have to sell to the American people a story before they say go get them. We said, hey, listen, guys, we're doing our best to secure energy independence or a pipeline. The American public will say, what are you talking about? Give them a story with dead babies and a weird guy with a funny accent, and that's a different story. That's what Americans love to hear.
Well, sure, and there's a divide. Let's be very clear about this. The fact that there's so much tension in American politics, the fact that, when Trump came in, there were riots in the streets and the airports were being seized and all of that. There's a divide among the circles of power in the U.S. I would say there's one faction that is very globally oriented and doesn't trust Donald Trump and is probably closer to the CIA. And there's another faction that's probably closer to the Pentagon, which probably represents, more domestic interests, companies that are based here, not the big oil companies, not the big banks, but more like maybe the Walton family that owns Walmart, right? And there's a big divide about what role the United States should play in the world. And when Donald Trump took office with his America First rhetoric and all this, that section that was a little more isolationist felt victorious, right? And this is the frackers, too. Let's keep that in mind. The fracking companies that are getting their oil domestically and extracting domestic oil, these are not the big four major oil companies. These are smaller, kind of tycoon, smaller companies. They were for Trump, and they said, let's focus on us. Let's stop helping out the big oil companies that have these global interests. And they felt victorious. And then from the moment that Trump took office, there was a fight between these two different factions among the powers that be. And Trump was kind of siding with this more isolationist, more U.S.-focused section. And he was under attack, right? Now, you had the airport, you had the travel ban and all the outrage about that. You had Chuck Schumer, the author of the most anti-immigrant bill back in 2006, the one that, there were all those huge protests against. You remember the Schumer bill?
Right.
Well, after the travel ban, he's giving a press conference and he's just crying, these poor immigrants, I feel so much for. Oh, give me a break. How Come on. And it was an intense fight within the government. And then you have the allegation that Trump is a Russian agent and, have impeachment here, the talk of impeachment and this investigation going on and all of this. And, but then it seems that the forces that were afraid that Trump might be some more of an isolationist, the forces that were afraid that Trump might carry out a different strategy for managing the U.S. economy and might be serving this more domestic constituency rather than the big globalist bankers. That faction seems to have been defeated. Steve Bannon, an interesting character. I don't agree with the man on practically anything, but if you look at what the man has said and written, this is an economic nationalist. This is an isolationist. You'll notice the day before all of this happened, he was gone. He was out.
Yep.
Right. And mysteriously. And we had, the whole thing around Michael Flynn, and Michael Flynn was out. And now you'll notice in the mainstream media, a lot of the voices that were so critical of Donald Trump that would have you think we were on the verge of Germany in 1933. And, it was just a day before they burned the Reichstag and half the country's in camps. It was this alarmist atmosphere. Well, now all these people are now all of a sudden praising Donald Trump for attacking Syria. Right? I mean, this shows that there has been...
You're right, though. That's the political part of it. Let's go back, and you and I are familiar with this. We have been asking, Caleb, where is the evidence of any kind of Russian collusion in terms of affecting the election of 2016? We don't have anything. There's been... Okay, so all of a sudden, when Trump could do one of two things, now dost thou doubt me now, America? Showing the hands, the stigmata. Dost thou doubt me now, Thomas? Dost thou doubt me now that I am obviously no friend of him? And he can also say, excuse me, I'm too busy right now. I am now the commander-in-chief. Oh, and by the way, Hillary, to you, the Bronx cheer to you, and Obama. And I never thought that I would ever say, Caleb, I never thought that I would ever think that Samantha Power seemed an adult and moderate compared to Nikki Haley, who, by the way, reads positions like a hostage statement with all the oomph and sincerity of somebody reading something that was just handed to her. Sure. And I cannot believe, and I thought that Samantha Power, this Valkyrie, this termagant, this fury, along with Susan Rice and Hillary, I thought these are the three furies. They're nothing. They're Emma Goldman compared to Nikki Haley. Now, let's change a little bit here. Are you not fascinated, as I am, with the relativistic sense of mourning? Mosul, 200 innocent people killed, American-based attacks. The children, no mention of the children. No mention of the children. Aleppo. Remember the difference between Aleppo was this horrible, horrible attack in Syria. But Mosul was it was like George Carlin's baseball routine. Baseball, football. Sure. Mosul targeted, synchronized. I mean, it was synchronized, beautiful, surgical. Aleppo, a mess. How, and you know a little bit, where are the mainstream media holding up the bodies of the beautiful dead children who gagged to death in Mosul?
Yeah. Hey, it's just, we've seen this before. Let's be real, I mean, at first we were going into Iraq because they had weapons of mass destruction. Oh, well, then they didn't actually have them. So then it turned into, we got to rescue those Iraqis from evil Saddam Hussein, right? They're just suffering under that brutal dictator. And Bush, he was just, out of the goodness of his heart, he was so moved. He just had such concern.
Babies in incubators.
Innocent. Oh, right. Well, that was the Naria testimony, right? That was the Gulf War. Right, there was this testimony from what they said was a nurse in a hospital who'd seen the Iraqi babies being pulled out of incubators, thrown onto the floor. She was crying. They showed it on CNN on loop practically to psych the U.S. public up for war. It turned out she had not even given that testimony under oath, right? She was a member of the Kuwaiti royal family. She had been in the United States the entire time. There's no way she could have even been in this hospital. Google it, the Naria testimony. It's fascinating. I mean, we've seen this routine over and over and over again. I mean, it's just the oldest trick in the book.
Now,
and what it gives me hope in a way, though, in a weird way, right? If people were really, sadistic, selfish monsters, it wouldn't work. What they're manipulating is people's basic feelings of human solidarity. Human beings are good deep down for the most part. They care about other people. We just have some very, very evil people that are running our governments that have figured out how to manipulate and dupe those feelings into a drive for war. And that's the problem.
I am fascinated by the relativistic perception, the psychology of this. We have people who talk about who are loath to even embrace the so-called dread conspiracy theory for a second. False flag. How dare you if you talk about 9/11 or false flag or, God forbid, school shootings, you're sick. But within an hour after the St. Petersburg blast, they said, there's Putin for you. They are facile. They are capable of using these theories. But let's talk about something when it comes to the rudiments of this.
Sure.
If, we are terrific. When last night I was watching, it was horrible. There was Griffin or whatever her name is, I don't know, Shep Smith was talking to this woman who, and I don't mean to be disgusting about this, but if I didn't know better, I think it was almost getting to be sexual. When we talk about, and these Tomahawk missiles, they're like telephone poles, and they weigh a lot, and they're kind of slow, but boy, 15, and they kept talking about the size of these things. Now, they love to hear that.
Here's what they should be saying about those Tomahawk missiles. Every single one of them costs over $1 million.
Almost over $1.5 million. Yep.
Yeah. So think about all the teachers who are being laid off.
Oh, stop
Think
it.
about all the hospitals that are closing across this country. Think about the fact that we don't even have proper water purification across this country. The bridges that people drive over are not secure. But we are spending money to destroy Syria while our own country is falling apart.
You're just
I sound like Donald Trump. This is what Trump said during his campaign.
Now you're bringing back history. Good. Now you remember. Now, here's my favorite. Yes. While we're experts, it's like, you don't want to say, so you know something about weapons all of a sudden. You, who were never in the military, but you're an expert. Okay, let's talk about chemical weapons. Let's talk about sarin. When the white helmets came in, and how these guys slipped under the radar, I'll never know. But they're picking up bodies and tossing people around, and everybody who knows the first thing about weapons says, if these were sarin attacks, first of all, they're not wearing hazmat. You don't go in and just move people around and pick them up and throw them in the back of a truck. It's almost as though either A, they weren't sarin or chlorine attack or whatever it was, or that they had been, I know this sounds far-fetched, but it's been suggested, not from me, killed elsewhere and trucked in or filmed somewhere else like it was alleged in Ghouta. Why doesn't anybody suggest that?
Well, the version of events that we've heard from Russia is that there was an arms depot in this territory, because let's be real, so this territory that was struck was not under the control of the Syrian government. This was a territory that was under control of the anti-government forces.
In Idlib.
And the version of events that has been speculated about, of course, they're waiting for an investigation. They're not saying that they know what happened. They're not claiming to be clairvoyant, like they have, psychic powers like Nikki Haley and Rycroft seem to pretend they know exactly what happened without any evidence. But they're speculating that what happened was that this arms depot, under the control of the al-Nusra terrorists, was hit with an airstrike. And in that arms depot, there was sarin nerve gas. And it is documented, extensively documented, that the al-Nusra terrorists have been stockpiling and using sarin nerve gas. There's no dispute about that. So it's very possible that when you blow up an arms depot that belongs to the al-Nusra terrorists, there's going to be sarin nerve gas everywhere, right? It's going to, you blow up an arms depot that has a bunch of chemical weapons in it, and they don't just, they don't just vanish. They're then spewed everywhere. That happens. And then that raises the question about the airstrip that we hit. Because if we, the United States, I'm speaking, in the royal or U.S. we, I guess, not me, but if the U.S. intelligence really believed that this airstrip, this airbase that they hit, actually had chemical weapons in it, why would they attack it? Wouldn't they be afraid that sarin nerve gas would go out everywhere? And then, if it had them, right, and they're so sure about it, how come when they hit this airbase, there wasn't a whole bunch of chemicals everywhere? Why aren't we hearing about Syrians all ducking and covering up and dying from all the chemicals that went everywhere when they blew this place up?
That's very good of you, but I heard that what they suggested was that this is where they took off from. Now, Either way, it's a good point. All I know is that if somebody, in World War II, especially in the Pacific Theater, the worst thing to do is to wear a flamethrower, because the people who put the flamethrowers on their backs, those brave Marines, the first person that any sniper aimed for is the guy who has on his back basically a pressurized gasoline machine. So that's the way that theory works. You don't want to bomb something or go after something that houses something which, when exploded, can vaporize and waft and kill and that sort of thing. But here is the problem, though. In order for us to go there, we have a mainstream media who now, and by the way, imagine being Rachel Maddow. What is she thinking right now? First of all, she's beating Bill O'Reilly. He's down to like 3 or 4 different ads. She's scrapped in place of Donald of Brian Williams. So all of a sudden she ratchets up, and it's not about her, but she says, I'm attacking Stephen Colbert, everybody. Caleb, in the community, you just come out, and now all of a sudden people say, hold it, wait a minute, this is our hero now, lay off.
Well, and you could see this coming. Now, let's remember, in the Wall Street Journal, I believe it was on Monday, before this chemical attack took place, or allegedly took place, there was a big article about the real winner in the Syrian war is Hezbollah, right? And let's remember that the leader of Hezbollah, let me back up. That was not accurate what I just said. Not a leader of Hezbollah, but a man accused of allegedly funding Hezbollah, Qasem Tajuddin, was arrested in Morocco and extradited to the United States. And there's been all of this play in the media about how Iran and Hezbollah are gaining all this influence in Syria because they've been fighting on behalf of the Syrian government. And that just, all of a sudden, it seemed to come out of nowhere. And then next, there's this chemical attack. You can almost smell it coming in the media. You mentioned Rachel Maddow. I don't regularly watch her show at this point. I just don't have the time or the stomach for it. But at one point, I did regularly watch her show, and that was back in 2010. And this was before the Libyan war began. But I remember all of a sudden she started doing hit pieces about a random leader. I guess she was just randomly outraged by him, named Muammar Gaddafi. This is before the Arab Spring and everything. And she was running hit pieces about how he had these bodyguards and they were so beautiful and maybe they were actually his prostitutes, not really his bodyguards. And, oh, what a jerk he is. And all of a sudden, she was just doing these regular pieces about how awful Gaddafi was. And then, lo and behold, the Arab Spring happens, and then all of a sudden, the U.S. is sending in the NATO missiles to take out Gaddafi. These things are not every war in which the person targeted, and I don't even like the fact that we refer to the Syrian government as Assad. The Syrian government is not one man, okay? He is the leader, he's the president, there's a big cult of personality, his picture's everywhere and such, but let's be real. The Syrian government is Christians in some of the oldest churches in the world. It's Alawites. It's Sunni Muslims. It's fact workers. It's postal workers who are delivering the mail, wondering if they're going to get blown up on the way to work as they're trying to deliver the mail and hold society together. It's just ordinary people in Syria who don't like jihad and don't like al-Qaeda and don't like extremism. And when they say the Assad government, you're supposed to think of this bad guy, right? They did the same thing with Iraq, right? They never said, we attacked Iraq and attacked Iraq. No, it was we attacked Saddam. We attacked Saddam forces and all of this. And by putting the name Assad in place of Syria, you can take away from people what's actually going on here.
Well, look what they're doing now, by the way. They're calling it, of course, the Putin regime. The regime. Now, 2 questions. First of all, what is this barrel bombs they keep talking about? All of a sudden, when somebody says, don't forget, Assad was responsible for dropping barrel bombs on his people from helicopters. He's a killer. He's a despotic, horrible man who dropped barrel bombs. And I know for a fact by how they are saying they don't know what they're talking about. What is the barrel bomb story?
Well, we'll remember back in 2013, Syria turned over all of their chemical weapons. They turned them all over to Russia. And
so they said.
Well, it was overseen by the United Nations. And I guess John Kerry must be a dirty liar, because if you read his tweets, he describes in detail how, the last bit of Syria's chemical weapons was turned over. So I guess either John Kerry was being deceived, or he was lying, or, he's secretly working for Putin and Assad. Maybe he's a Putin agent. I mean, come on. But anyway, regardless, so, Syria turned over their chemical weapons. However, Syria has a water system. right? I mean, they treat their water, right? And one item that they do have in their country, which could be used as a chemical weapon, is chlorine, right? Chlorine is used to treat water. That's what it's generally used for. However, if you use it, if you drop it from a helicopter in a barrel and it explodes or something like that, it can be used as a chemical weapon. Now, we remember in Iraq, right? There were the sanctions on Iraq following the Gulf War, and they would not allow Iraq to acquire any chlorine. And as a result, and this is according to 60 Minutes and according to the World Health Organization, 500,000 children under the age of 12 died from drinking water that was not purified in Iraq because for a decade, the U.S. sanctions would not allow them to get chlorine because, in theory, chlorine could be used as a chemical weapon, right? So, and I guess now there's debate about these barrel bombs. People say, I mean, we're getting people that are rebels, people that are connected to anti-government groups in Syria, people connected to the White Helmets, people connected to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. That sounds all hoity-toity, but it's all people who fled from Syria and don't like the government and happen to be hanging out in Britain. They have accounts supposedly of helicopters flying over villages, dropping barrel bombs or dropping barrels full of chlorine that then explode. But, there's a lack of evidence. There's not pictures. There's not even if this is the case, how would they know that those helicopters were from the Syrian government? How would you identify that? No one wants to ask these questions. They have a pre-made narrative for us, and all the facts are just supposed to fit right into it.
Precisely.
Yeah. And why are we not carrying out an investigation? Right? I mean, if we're going to launch a war against the Syrian government, a government that's at war with ISIS, if we're going to do that, shouldn't we wait for all the facts to be discovered first? I mean, isn't that just kind of basic logic? I mean, don't you, you don't want to execute the wrong guy, right? I mean, that's why you have appeals, I mean, it's like you can't unbomb the airbase. We can't undo what we just did if we discover we're wrong. We can't go, whoops, well, we take it back, we can't do that, right? I mean, this is a very serious situation. Now, from what we understand, the Russian military was warned about it. And I guess, we should all be thankful that happened, because if the Russians had gotten hit at this air base and not known what was happening, they might have shot back. And, not just the United States, but also the Russians have nuclear weapons. And we could pretty soon be in a really, really bad situation here.
And the Russians are in Tartus. They have been there forever. They have a naval base there in Syria, correct?
Yes. And I mean, that was part of bringing Syria up out of poverty, was that, when it was the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s, they went there and they built dams, they built hospitals. I mean, Syria's life expectancy drastically increased during the 1980s, mainly because the Assad government, or the Syrian government, the Baath socialist government in Syria, and the Soviet Union were cooperating economically. China's also been cooperating with the Syrian government. There's a lot of infrastructure going on there. A lot of plumbing and pipes are being built. It's a country that has been trying to modernize itself. It's trying to build itself up. They're a poor, underdeveloped country and in a very poor region of the world. There's a lot of poverty there, but they're doing their best. They have a nationalist government that is trying to raise the country up, to stabilize the place and build it up in the interest of the people that live there. And that's what's going on. And that's something that, whether it's, Mossadegh in Iran, whether it's Salvador Allende in Chile, that's something the guys in the CIA have never really tolerated. They don't like it when you have a government that looks out for the people of that country. They want a puppet government that works for the Wall Street bankers, kind of like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
How is it that you are so conversant and expert in that narrative, and so many good and hardworking Americans just live in a parallel universe? Is it the media? Is it the media collectively? What is it? American exceptionalism? Do you know how many people I have talked to today, friends of mine, who are saying, oh, would you please just support the president? I'm saying, listen, there's a lot that Trump has done that I think's terrific, or at least he said. I'm not sitting back and marching in lockstep. I'm not a minor bird. I don't pledge fealty to my commandante. I don't understand this. He's letting me down. This makes no sense, especially after he said this. It's as though somebody came to him and said, listen, you're going to do things our way. You don't understand something. You're all alone. There's nobody. And all of a sudden, Gorsuch is through, and all of a sudden, he has a swagger and a cachet now because he's done something. America loves this leader. Watch his poll numbers go. And Hillary Clinton, what do you think she's thinking right now? What do you think Hillary Clinton, Madam Hillary?
That's the whole thing, right? Throughout the campaign, Donald Trump said he was going to put Hillary Clinton in jail. That was what he said, right? She's going to be in an orange jumpsuit. You know, she'll be in jail. She's crooked Hillary, crooked Hillary. Well, 3 hours before he attacked the Syrian air base, Hillary Clinton was on CNN. And she said, you know, somebody really ought to attack that Syrian air base. So is he taking his orders from crooked Hillary? Is that what's going on here? What's going on here? You know, Trump's whole image was he's fighting the establishment. He's for the average Joe against these elites. Their victories were not our victories. Our defeats were not their defeats. We remember all of that. What happened to all of that, right? What happened here? I think, you know, there was all this talk that, you know, I mean, you remember the BuzzFeed story, and there was all this, what do the Russians have on Trump? Well, I think somebody else has something on Trump, and that somebody else is in the Central Intelligence Agency. We saw how all those leaks were coming out of the White House. All this classified information from the administration was finding its way to the press. Every other word or every other story was, according to an anonymous source, all kinds of inside information at the White House. They had him just where they wanted him. And Bannon's gone, Flynn's gone, and this shows the problem is not individuals, and this is what it gets down to. A lot of people long for some kind of savior. They're longing for some kind of great leader, you know. But the problem is not individuals, right? I mean, a lot of people in the country desperately want change. Obama kind of packaged a left-wing hope and change. Donald Trump packaged a right-wing hope and change. But when it really gets down to it, most Americans are getting tired of their civil liberties being taken away. They're getting tired of all these wars going on overseas. They don't like the fact that our wages are drastically dropping and our standard of living is decreasing, that formerly prosperous neighborhoods are now full of foreclosed homes. And these are Americans on both the left and the right. They're just not liking what's happening in their country. And they're mad about it. And the change, they pick a leader, somebody who's going to be on a white horse and ride in to save them. But the problem isn't an individual. The problem is systemic. It's much deeper. It's much deeper than any individual is going to solve. The problems are rooted in the way the society is set up. The problems here are much bigger than one individual or one election can change.
You know, from the times of Cicero, from cui bono to cui prodest, who benefits from this? Who is off the radar? You know, years ago, this might be before a lot of people's times, but when Gary Condit was alleged to have killed this Chandra Levy, this congressman, all of a sudden, Robert Blake, his murder case came, and we live in a one-at-a-time world. Sorry. So, and I used to joke it was Condit, or maybe I'm getting in reverse, but the point is, Susan Rice. Who? Next. Now it's war. Because you have to understand something. You have cable news companies whose newsrooms are shuttered. You have 20-year-old line producers who are ready to go. You have a Rolodex of old, hoary, mothballed, concretized generals ready to be called in. You're going to have the graphics department doing attack on Syria, Operation Homs, or in Hom's way. I'm surprised there's no pun there or something. But anyway, but that's what's going on. Remember, that's what's fueling it. So think about what's going on. Hillary's off the map, maybe perhaps permanently, but the Susan Rice, what that story was. Do you realize, Caleb, how serious that was? You have intel. This is because the deep state is intel and military industrial complexes combined. That's gone now. Now it's just our leader at Mar-a-Lago. And by the way, what do you think? You know more about this than I do. What do you think? Is it chairman? Is it Xi? How do you pronounce his name?
Xi, right. President of China. Xi, yeah.
What do you think Xi was thinking when he said, "Excuse me, I'll be a little late. Oh, by the way, you must forgive me. I just sent some Tomahawk missiles over to Syria." Now, let's talk about the China Sea. Let's talk about Korea, shall we? What do you think that timing was?
Yeah, well, that's even more interesting. Now, the Chinese have not deployed forces to Syria like the Russians and others have, but they have been providing military training to the Syrian army to fight against terrorists. That's one thing that they've been doing. And prior to the war, Syria was an economic partner of China. They had a lot of contracts. A lot of Chinese businesses were there. And China, they weren't as fired up as Bolivia or Russia was, but they were adamant they didn't approve of this unilateral attack. And, you got to hand it to the Bolivian ambassador at the United Nations. He held the UN charter. He said, you can't do this. This is like item number one. The whole reason we have UN Security Council is one country can't attack. It's to prevent wars. And it was just completely flaunted. So many interesting things here. You talked about the media. And, I'll tell you, occasionally I will encounter an unintelligent person.
What?
Who will say to
occasionally?
Will say to me, "Oh, you work for RT. How could you work for them?" Well, I'm sorry, but the people that are telling us to go to war right now, MSNBC, who owns that? It's General Electric. They're one of the top military contractors.
Well, it's Comcast, but they're maybe.
It's MSNBC, and where are they broadcasting from? Rockefeller Center. Who are the Rockefellers? Right?
Here we go.
Billionaires.
You're going to bring up the Illuminati next, aren't you?
No, I'm not talking Illuminati. You don't need a conspiracy theory to explain this.
I'm kidding.
Rich people like to make money. I know. I'm just going there.
Let me go back for just a second. Stop for 1 second. There was a time. Remember when it was GE or NBC, GE Universal, and GE and Jeffrey Immelt, who was the CEO, who was on Obama's, he was economic advisor. And lo and behold, they got, through GE credit or TARP money. Now imagine what it would be like if Rupert Murdoch got government funding to bail out Fox News or whatever it was. They'd be riding in the street. So all of a sudden, forget people always thought the MSN, that there was this big Bill Gates connection. The Microsoft part had nothing to do with it. All of a sudden, when Phil Donahue, remember Phil Donahue?
Oh, yeah.
The #1 rated show, and they knew who Phil Donahue was. Phil Donahue, they knew exactly his breed, his pedigree, his records, his provenance. They knew everything about him. And he comes out basically being Phil Donahue. They bounced his ass so fast it made his head spin. And they fancied themselves as being the left. But before I forget, what's going to happen now with North Korea? Because Trump's flexing his muscles, and you've got, of course, the madman as portrayed by the media. What's going to happen with North Korea, and what's the connection between Xi and North Korea, and what should we be watching for?
Well, that's an interesting question. Now, I think it's very interesting, right? The two countries that supposedly Trump was thinking about attacking, Syria and North Korea. Well, the North Koreans have been there for a long, long time. I mean, since 1945, they have been, there's been a Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And since the armistice that ended the Korean War, they haven't been directly attacked. Now, there have been threats against them. There's been sanctions. But very interesting. That whole country is quite militarized. And at this point, they have nuclear weapons. Remember, we fought the Iraq War because Saddam Hussein supposedly had, was trying to get nuclear weapons, had weapons of mass destruction. Well, he didn't have them. He's gone. Gaddafi, he had a program to supposedly develop nuclear weapons. He got rid of it, right? He got rid of it. He abandoned it. He's gone, right? But the North Koreans actually have their weapons. It looks like that has bought them a level of security. We always hear on American TV that they want to nuke the U.S. We should all be terrified. No, they want to deter any potential attack on them. That's what they thought nuclear proliferation was about. And they seem to have been proven correct. These wars don't seem to be deterring nuclear proliferation. They seem to be sending a pretty clear message. You better get them if you don't want to be destroyed, right? That seems to be the message that's coming out of all of these wars. And China does not approve of DPRK's nuclear proliferation. They've made that clear. They think it's, North Korea withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. China does not approve of that. But China does have a lot of economic relations with North Korea. They buy their coal. North Korea is a mountainous country. We talk about the food crisis and all that. That's because all the arable land is in the south, and they're mountainous. But they have a lot of coal, And China buys a lot of their coal. And, China doesn't have to buy a lot of their coal either. They have plenty of coal in China, too. I mean, they're the top steel producer in the world at this point. Half of the steel, 50%, it comes from the state-owned steel company in China. So China's buying North Korean coal is a political gesture. This is their neighbor. This is a country that is on their side. This is a country they sent troops to defend during the Korean War.
Oh, yes.
Mao Zedong's own son died in the Korean War defending the Koreans. So, there's a history there. And while I think that the North Koreans are much more, I guess you could say, quote unquote, anti-American in their rhetoric. They'll talk about American imperialism and all of that. China would prefer to get along with the United States. They like to have American businesses over there investing and doing business. But the two countries, they're both countries, and the same as Syria, the same as Iraq, the same as Iraq. Any country that's targeted, these are countries that have independent governments that are trying to build themselves poverty. Think about what happened in 1949. I mean, this was a country that it was they called it the sick man of
for some particular reason, we're getting a lot of hesitation. That wonderful Skype.
We're getting interruptions. We're getting interference on the channel.
It's very stylistic because right when you're making your best point, you get one of these things and we're frozen. Let me just leave it at this. Last question, Caleb Maupin. Thank you so much for being with me and sharing this. What is Russia's role in this? What will Russia do next? What should we be looking for as to Russia and Syria and President Trump?
Well, Russia has aligned with the Syrian government. It's a longtime friend of theirs, and we shouldn't expect Russia to just abandon their ally. That would look very, very bad if Russia were to just walk away from Syria and say, you know what, USA, you got this one. And I think we shouldn't expect Russia to do that. That would discredit them on the international stage. I think Russia intends to stand behind the Syrian government.
But it has been said, and you've heard this as well, that President Putin and others have said, look, while we're allies, we're not necessarily going to go crazy if there's regime change or if Assad steps down. Or we're not. They've said this for a long time. They're not representing or supporting Syria does not necessarily mean they are tethered or walking in lockstep with President Assad. So they would not necessarily be not against perhaps a peaceful or otherwise transition of power or whatever it is. But the problem, though, is that you and I know this. When you remove somebody, there's a vacuum. With whom do you replace this person? The devil you know or the devil you don't know?
I think that they're feeling, from my assessment of it, I'm not Russian, I'm not a Russian diplomat, I don't have access to that kind of stuff. But my understanding of their position is that they feel that the leadership of Syria should be determined by the people of Syria. It shouldn't be determined by the United States or the European Union or by al-Qaeda or al-Nusra. It should be determined by the people residing in Syria, that they have the right to pick their own government. And at this moment, they have chosen President Assad. And so we'll have to see what happens next. But it's up to the Syrian people to determine their own destiny.
Caleb Maupin, as usual, you wow me with your encyclopedic knowledge, your sense of history, your insight. You are, sir, without peer. I thank you immensely. I'm so proud to know you. Let us do it again. Caleb Maupin.
Absolutely.
I will have all of your bona fides here at the bottom of this particular YouTube entry, and I thank you so very much. Caleb Maupin, thank you, sir.
It's a pleasure.